Paul Harvey from Humanitarian Outcomes. So I've worked with Catherine Adele, but I'd like to really congratulate Catherine Adele on this research. Do have a look not just at the network paper, but the wider body of work on SaveResearch.net that's been launched today, because there's a rich, really sort of empirical, rigorous research looking at questions that are often sort of opinion-based. And so we're providing some real empirics around sort of where is everyone and can you do good in difficult environments. And there are some really uncomfortable messages there. I mean, three stick out in the network paper for me. One is sort of beware relying on the UN. One is don't have double standards between national NGOs and international NGOs. Another is don't exaggerate presence. And then there's a sort of argument for agencies needing to rub donors' faces in the risks and the hard choices that they're having to make. And that's a difficult thing for agencies to be willing to do, and particularly on an individual rather than a coordinated basis. And it's a difficult potential message for donors. And so a question either for Catherine or possibly for Diffid, who I think are in the room, is are you willing to have your faces rubbed in those risks? And are you willing to have a more honest conversation with the agencies that you're funding about the hard choices they're having to make in difficult places?
Thanks, Paul. There was one over here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm a SOAS, master's student at SOAS. And my question is somewhat parallel to, I guess, what you've been talking about. You've talked a lot about the physical risks that you face in practicing in high-risk areas. I was wondering if you could comment on possibly the legal ramifications for undertaking some of those ethical decisions that you're making, such as employing militia groups that are possibly involved in human rights abuses, the legal ramifications of paying bribes in order to get your aid, and if those kinds of legal ramifications are a part of your decision-making in acting in high-risk activities.
Okay, thank you. Any more in the room? Yes.
I'm Fadla Woman from Muslim Aid. I'd just like to ask, when you're doing, well, we try to, whenever I've been, we've tried to do acceptance approach with the local community. But sometimes when you discuss things with the local community and you ask their assistance, you have an ethical problem because your discussions and your involvement of local, even faith-based leaders in your work can cause dangers to them. So how do you resolve this sort of ethical issue? Because you need the cooperation of the local community, but when you do, and you can't work without the cooperation of the community, but if you do involve them to some extent, you might put their lives at danger.
Okay, that's great. Catherine, I'm going to go back to you to see if you'd like to comment on any of those questions. We have Paul's looking at, do we, I suppose from the research that you did, do you think donors are willing to have their faces rubbed in the risks? Was, I think, the nub of the question. And also maybe a comment on the legal ramifications and also the possibility of risk transfer to the people that you're working with.
Yeah, I think actually those two questions are very much linked. One of the interesting things that we saw in the research is that organizations are very concerned about counter-terrorist legislation and getting caught out, having to go to court for, paying a particular armed group that is a designated terrorist group. But I think these concerns, so there is very much lingering confusion about what constitutes material support under the law, under many, there's many different laws, there's many different countries. It's a very confusing subject, and there's a lot of misinformation as well. So there's that, but that, in our mind, what we saw was interesting is that those concerns were very much heightened, not just for particular groups that were designated terrorist organizations by, designated by particular governments, but really by specific organizations that were of specific political concern to donors. So for example, ISIS and Al-Shabaab were the ones that were most frequently of concern for donors and by extension for agencies as well. But other groups that were designated terrorist organizations were not. So it doesn't seem to be directly connected to the legal concerns. Instead, it seems to be a much more political equation that the organizations are weighing vis-a-vis their donors. And what was really interesting was that a lot of the individual donor representatives are very, very, really understanding people. They can have very honest conversations one-on-one and face-to-face with organizations, and be very supportive when there's really high humanitarian needs. They can make things happen and allow programs to go ahead. It's sort of tends to be when anything is put in writing, or sometimes 2 or 3 years further down the track when it comes time to do an audit, that a different part of the donor agency gets involved, and that's when things tend to become very different, and the risk tolerance equation changes a lot. So I think it's kind of about raising up these questions to a higher level, because it's really within the donor agencies. It's not so much the individual donor representative on the ground. It's the whole of government, and often all the way up to Parliament, and then by extension, taxpayers from these donor countries that have the questions about risk that really need to be answered.
Thanks. Fiona, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I thought that what Catherine said is, I agree totally. I think that the donors are definitely willing to talk. I mean, as Abdurrahman said, the zero tolerance is just not possible in certain places where corruption is so endemic, where there's no functioning state, where it's been decades that people have paid for services or paid their way through. To imagine that we can somehow come in and work completely outside this is impossible. But so we need to have this discussion. And I think the donors will be open to it.
Mm. And on the question of the legal ramifications, I mean, Imran, do you have anything to say?
I agree with Catherine. It's yes, certainly there is uncertainty, and then of course that leads agencies to sort of err on the side of caution. But very often the discussion seems to be more political than legal. So there are armed groups that don't seem to be discussed as much. They are, by their very nature, armed factions controlling roads, access, and it seems it's acceptable to have conversations with them, but significantly not with others. And I think that's again due to the bigger sort of political picture. I mean, in terms of donors, I'm just touching on the zero tolerance thing and the shifting of risk. I mean, I've sort of witnessed conversations where pretty much literally in the same sentence, a donor will be talking about zero tolerance, but by the end of the sentence will be asking, can you deliver this aid to the particular area that we've just discussed, where you've highlighted the 75 risks that you may face, that may put you in a situation of all sorts of complex legal situations due to counter-terrorism. Can you deliver that aid? So we're then saying, well, look, really, what's the message we're getting from you? The messages sometimes from governments and donors are very much mixed, and that they are, trying to manage their own internal conversations about their what's important to them, and there are quite clearly tensions within government. But again, those risks are being shifted down the line, and ultimately it rests very heavily on those local partners. And at a time when we're all committed to a process of localization, I mean, trying to engage with more local national partners, we're signatories to Charter for Change, a number of NGOs are, which is committed to sort of directing 20% of our funding directly to those local national organizations. But when we look at those, that their ability to implement and their ability to manage risk, we find that again there are a number of tensions there. Are we able to deliver on the localization agenda when we've got so many overarching concerns about counter-terrorism? How do we assess the ability and appropriateness of a partner to deliver that in the final mile? And I think there are very complex questions there. So we are trying to capacity build with local partners in Syria, but in the context of lack of resources, lack of clarity, our own lack of knowledge of the civil society in Syria pre-war. We have to do so much in terms of due diligence, and internally within our organisation, there are clear tensions between our finance people who do the sort of screening and the due diligence, and the humanitarians whose job it is to deliver. We got incredible tensions there, sort of almost fisticuffs in the corridor, shall I say? But therein lies the tension.
Yes. Thank you for that. Abdurrahman, you have any comment on
Yeah.
any of those three?
Yeah, I also wanted to try, if DFID is not going to answer, to answer the question on DFID in the Somalia context at least. I don't know if you've seen, but recently the Independent Commission on Aid Impact actually produced a report looking at DFID's work on fiduciary risk in a number of fragile contexts, because DFID is investing more and more its money on fragile contexts, and it came to Somalia as well as part of that. But I think I think as a donor, what I've noticed is that at least in the Somalia context, DFID has been one of the most proactive donors in this area. They funded, the risk management unit of the UN. We've developed the risk management standards and accountability framework that was funded by DFID. And they've been the donors have been upfront in talking about these issues, and I think it's important to recognize it. But the challenges then come about how you manage it, and then I think some donors are managing it in a way where they've decided to work with less and less agencies. A selected few who they trust have the right risk frameworks in place, and that poses challenges to the agenda of localization that we're trying to push and put forward in contexts like Somalia. Around the legal framework and legal ramifications, again, I think I'll just mention what Paul said. He called it double standards. We report it and we talk about it when we want, and when we don't want, we just close an eye and compromise. But the other challenge is, for example, if you're a donor or so on, and you also identify that the money has not been used appropriately, is if that instance occurs, where do you sue the organization who mismanaged the money is a challenge. And that's why donors again are deciding less and less to work with agencies. Less agencies, but also agencies who maybe only who have registration in their countries, like in the UK or in the US, and so on. Again, another challenge for localization to look at. But I think in terms of putting the lives at risk that Fadlullah mentioned, there is no one size fits all solution. I think it's something that you have to manage on a day-to-day basis, and understand what risks people face, and see how you can manage it on a day-to-day basis. I think what people and the dynamics are changing. I'll give you an example. Is that now for the first time ever in Somalia, we've got a city, a town in the north in Puntland that has been taken over by ISIS in Kandala and Puntland. There were a few NGOs operating there, and the first step they took as soon as they heard that news, they evacuate all local staff that were involved or operating in that area, and take them to safe places. And I think NGOs are taking more of those approaches in trying to protect these people before the problems occur. And that's why you have to manage risk on a day-to-day basis to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to take some questions from the online audience now. Let me just see if my computer skills allow me not to delete the questions before I can actually read them. We've got one from Rachel Wade from Durham University, who'd like to ask the panel, is fear of litigation now having an impact on humanitarian work on a large scale, as it has for a long time in the private sector? So that's about the fear of litigation. Is it having an impact on humanitarian work on the same scale or a large scale as in the private sector? And we have one from Sam Sherman, who's an independent humanitarian risk management specialist in Brussels. And he'd like to ask the panel, as INGOs working in higher risk contexts have frank discussions, he's put that in quotation marks, with donors on access, this can often mean searching for and using local community NGOs and gaining access, a transferal of risk without clarifying the actual risk. I think this is actually related to the question that you just raised and we just talked about. And so he was asking about the challenges in working with local NGOs. So although we've discussed that to some extent, if you have anything you want to add in that regard, we can do that. And then Claudia Meyer, who's at GPPI in Germany, would like to ask the panel, considering the media outrage after news on access compromises in Syria, how can we get to a point where we can talk honestly to donor agencies who are themselves subjected to parliamentary scrutiny? So again, is there anything else that we can do to sort of encourage that or work with donors on that? And then one more from, last question from the online audience at the moment. Melody Knight from Norwegian Refugee Council would like to ask, Fiona, directed to you specifically, you mentioned the value of an organization's consistency of judgment in the face of ethical dilemmas. Can you speak about the challenges of creating a framework for making these choices versus remaining flexible in the face of dilemmas? So again, this question about whether frameworks are helpful and what are the challenges there. Does it allow us sufficient flexibility? Shall we start with that one, or?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I definitely think that having a sort of a framework or a set of similar questions that one would pose, depending on the context, is very important. And just having a very lucid understanding of why an organisation decides to make this decision and not that decision. So that in the future, because as has been noted, situations change, you may need to go back and revise that decision. But also staff members change a lot. And I think it's very detrimental when there's a big staff turnover and one person goes off in one direction and then there's a knee-jerk reaction to that and some other people from the same organisation decide differently. I think that really solid moral and ethical decision-making depend upon looking at problems in the same way and making similar judgments, not always the same, but at least being able to explain why one would make this decision in this case and perhaps this one in this place, but always using the same ethical standards.
And documenting those decisions seems to, from the research that Catherine and her colleagues did, seems to be a very important one. And I know from my own experience in South Sudan during OLS, when I was country director for an agency there, we made a point of documenting those types of decisions, the action we took, the rationale for taking those decisions, and what we thought might be the potential impact. So I think that was certainly useful in practice for us.
And I think especially in contexts of very long protracted conflicts like Sudan, like Afghanistan, like South Sudan, because the players stay the same, but the organisations change. And then you end up being the looking stupid when these and being manipulated when organisations can, your interlocutors can say to you, yes, but back then you did this, and you have no idea what they're talking about. So very, very important.
Abdurrahman.
The risk of litigation, I think, is impacting humanitarian intervention on a large scale. And I think what you can see also is that in a context like Somalia, since the famine happened, you had a lot of investment, money put in response to the famine. But then after that, as soon as some of these cases came up, the money went down dramatically. But the needs are still, there and huge. We're talking about 4.9 million in need out of a population of 10 to 12 million, so half of the population in need, and that just shows you the attitude of it. But also from a risk dynamic, I think when you have so many risks, some agencies or some donors may tend to prioritize other contexts, and I'm not sure about the context, in Syria, and probably there's an analysis to do around how much operations occur outside of Syria versus inside Syria, and that could explain, the dynamics. And I think that is high, the risk of litigation, but also the risk, as you said, with parliaments looking at these issues and not understanding, very carefully, and it's a constant challenge, I think, that we need to communicate. But one of the things in terms of also, I think one of the other questions were about challenges of working with local NGOs. Is one thing I want to mention is that I don't think we have supported enough the agencies we work with in understanding how they can better negotiate access. and deal with access dynamics. What we're doing now is that in a couple of weeks, actually in 2 weeks' time, for the first time ever, we are organizing an access negotiation training developed by Conflict Dynamics for national staff. And again, that's an issue I want to highlight, is that the national staff are the ones who deal with access negotiation on a day-to-day basis, and they are the ones who need or require the skills and the abilities to do that in the best way possible. But also the work that some agencies do, and still we need to emphasize, is also highlighting, the humanitarian principles. And I think there's not emphasis enough on that, maybe because we're somehow accepting that, we don't comply with the principles because of the compromising element. But that's a challenge we face on a day-to-day basis, and we must not stop talking about and raising awareness about the humanitarian principles.
Yeah, on that note, just a sort of supplementary question, really. I mean, do you think it's possible for agencies to be or to be perceived as being principled and ethical despite having to make the compromises and concessions that inevitably they have to make?
I think it is. I think sometimes you have to make difficult decisions. And I want to praise, in the case of Somalia, what MSF did. They faced some difficult decisions, staff kidnapped, staff being killed, and they made the decision to close. And a lot of people got upset with it in the Somalia environment. But I think sometimes if you follow the ethics, you have to be able to make those ethical decisions. Now, some agencies don't want, because they have so many large operations, so many staff that they employ, and we're running as big enterprises in a way, and it's not easy to say when we need to stop that and when we need to say no. And that's why I highlight that doing it in a coordinated manner is important. I know that, Imran mentioned that, not everyone is coordinated and so on. I know that there are many weaknesses in the system, but the system can work. And there are concrete examples that I mentioned in Somalia, and I can mention much more, that when we are coordinated, we can, make those differences on the ground.
Okay, Catherine, do you have any reflections based on the wider research on that question? I mean, do you think, based on what you've found, that it is possible?
Sorry, that it's possible.
That it's possible for agencies
to really be principled. Yeah, well, I think it's it kind of goes to the heart of the question of what does it mean to be principled, and what are the principles, right? And so if there's this real live understanding of the tensions within the principles, specifically that there's kind of humanity and then the other ones, and that the other ones are really tools for the job, and humanity is the heart and the goal of humanitarian action. And so if you understand that, then it's compromising and balancing and working that out. That's a really principled thing in and of itself. So it's not so much about being principled or not being principled. It's about understanding the principles and seeing the tensions within them, and really knowing when you're making compromises and whether they're acceptable compromises or not. So yes, I think there's hope.
So taking humanity as the core principle.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to know if there are any other questions from the audience in the room. Yes.
Hi, Naomi Ellsworth. This has been a really enlightening panel session today. Thank you. I have a question that focuses more on the staff. And there are several NGOs who have a policy of evacuating only international staff and not local or national staff, and oftentimes not even informing the national local staff, where they'll come to work the next morning and realize everyone's left. And I know this has happened in a few instances. I'd like to know what the panel thinks about how this is handled, because I think it's an important part of trust and programming and so on, and valuing staff. Thank you.
Any other questions in the room? Got another one online, actually, I think. Let me just see. Okay, from Idil Osman at the Development Studies Department at SOAS, would like to ask Abdurrahman, how are Somali-led NGOs preparing for assisting Dadaab returnees? So that's a good one for you, Abdurrahman, to end on probably. Any other questions in the room? Yes. Let's wait for the microphone. Yeah.
Yes, my name's Judith Cook. I teach medical students on conflict and health. It was a question for Fiona Terry. In the context of increasing targeting of medical facilities and health workers, medical workers, and thinking about it in the context of what we've been talking about, and actually doing no harm to the recipients of aid, how does working above the radar with logos on your vehicles on where you're working, how does that play into harm to the recipients? Is there any possible way of NGOs working below the radar?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with that one. I'm going to, Fiona, that was to you specifically. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so if we could have short, sharp answers. Yeah.
Yes, sometimes organisations do work under the radar, and they have to because of this targeting. So I think it's inevitable that sometimes people choose different coloured cars, or they don't associate with, unfortunately, with their association in order to avoid being targeted. And I think you're right to highlight this issue. It's such a terrible issue, the attacks on healthcare structures around the world. And a lot of people are twisting the debate or talking about it mostly being sort of non-state armed groups doing this, but it's actually not. I mean, we are really seeing a lot of attacks by states, and we need to keep the pressure on to say this is completely and utterly unacceptable.
Thank you. Imran, I wonder if you could address Naomi's question about the evacuation of only international staff in some instances.
I think it's a very, very good question, and I think if I can sort of reflect on what we do, I think on some levels from the outside it doesn't look very good. I have to say, when as international NGOs, when you evacuate your international staff and national staff are seemingly still there operating, it's a very, very difficult one to explain. I mean, from our own experience, what we would do is, if there is a discussion around evacuation, I mean, there's a broader risk assessment, and we would have very clear and open discussions with national staff to say that we would not expect them to do anything that they're not happy to do. So if they are to remain in place, they'd often be working from home as much as possible, and certainly taking a number of measures to ensure that their visibility is reduced, and that we feel that there are significant safety levels achieved. But I think externally it always looks as if there is a clear policy of protecting international workers more than national workers, and I think perceptions will always remain, but I think we as an organisation would ensure that the new operational plan would have those staff interest at heart. We've lost a number of national staff, and I think only last month we lost 2 staff in Kenya, and we have. I think a bit like MSF, our meeting rooms in Birmingham are named after our staff who've died in the field. So we're very, very conscious that that's a major responsibility on our shoulders. But we would always ensure that the final decision really lies with the staff themselves. They are ultimately responsible for the final decision, and if they say we don't want to work, we can't function, then they would go home.
Thank you. Abdurrahman, do you want to address Adil's question and somehow link it back into our discussion around ethical decision-making in high-risk environments? And indeed, it is going to be a high-risk environment for many of the people concerned.
I think you'd need another hour to talk about returns from Dadaab to Somalia. But just to be brief, it just highlights the difficult decisions that agencies have to make in this context. I think there's no doubt that a lot of people think that it's it doesn't follow the right protection mechanisms and standard. That there's an agreement that it's not voluntary, as we've seen, returns. It is more perceived that people being pressurized to return because of the imminent closure of the camp. And so agencies have to make a decision. Even though we disagree with how the policy is being decided and operated, we still have to help those people and assist those people in the best capacity we can, even though we know that it's probably not voluntary, it's probably not safe to return, but there's something that we need to do to be able to assist those people. And really there's a lot of effort around trying to understand how best these people can be supported. But our advocacy on this has been that return is not a solution. Solution is the reintegration of these refugees into society, whether it is through resettlement or living in Kenya or back in Somalia, but also understanding that there are still also huge humanitarian gaps in Somalia aside from the returns that are happening. So let's not shift now the humanitarian dilemma to supporting returns. And again, the other paradigm is also that those returns also have more development components to it rather than humanitarian. When you talk about reintegration and so on, it's more development oriented, and so humanitarian and development actors need to work more closely in hand to do that. But there's a number of agencies now that are operating both in Dadaab and Kismayo to try and assist the process as much as they can.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but I wondered, Catherine, if you had any final words for us before we close.
No. I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I've really appreciated this discussion. It's been just incredibly rich, and I hope that you'll feel free to reach out to myself or to anyone in the SAVE team if you have questions. Do take a look at the website for the SAVE research, and thank you.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and especially Catherine for her excellent paper, and the discussion, to our panelists for joining us here today, because I agree, I think it's been a very interesting, rich discussion, and for your excellent questions and comments from the audience. So thank you again. Do take copies of the paper, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much. You'll see a video of the event, by the way, online on the ODI website within a day or two. And if you can, please join us for sandwiches and more conversation outside the room. Thank you very much.